Well, thanks for stopping by. Today's show is all about identity. User identity, identity of applications, and identity in the cloud. This episode is action-packed and it moves fast. But thankfully, you can always hit rewind. Welcome to Threat Actions This Week, the show where we look at the latest threats, tech, and actions your organization can take. Today's top security talent share their insights with you. And I'm joined by three individuals who have an incredible breadth and depth in the world of identity. First, joining us from the Seattle area, Sarah Squire, co-author of the NIST Digital Identity Guidelines Special Pub 800-63, Senior Technical Architect at Ping Identity. Welcome to the show, Sarah.
Thank you, David.
And Amir Sharif, he's in the Washington, D.C. area today on the other side of the nation. He's the founder of Aporeto, involved in cloud, microservices, and container security. That'll come in handy today. Glad you could join us, Amir.
Glad to be here, David. Thank you for having me.
And from the Toronto area up in Canada, we've got Wes Kroesbergen. He is the CTO and managing partner of Lumagate North America. He is elbows deep in Active Directory. He's a master of all things Azure, and he's unleashing a new bot onto the world that's either going to take over or that's going to help us a lot in terms of being able to just do everything we need to do from an IT standpoint. And its name is Simon. Wes, thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me here. I don't know if we're going to take over the world, but we're aiming to help the world anyway.
First, what we do is we go to the threat radar and find out what vulnerabilities and threats are the center of our guest radar screen this week. But I want to take a different view. So I want to step away from our sometimes cloistered day jobs and the fires that we're all putting out to consider the broader implications of the technologies and the implementations that we're doing with those technologies. So thinking about things like identity proofing, you are who you say you are, versus authentication, which is you have the access to do X or the access to get into X or Y or what have you. Sarah, when we think about the broader context of identity and think about it maybe from a social justice standpoint, what were some of the things that you needed to do in order to disambiguate, to separate out things like identity proofing from authentication?
So when I helped rewrite the digital identity guidelines, I was a contractor hired by the National Institute for Standards and Technology, NIST. NIST is actually under the Department of Commerce. So the goal of Special Publication 863 is to help a free market in terms of government determine what the best authentication and identity proofing solutions are. And the way that we do that is to define standards for them. The standards that we used to have were called levels of assurance, and there were levels of assurance 1 through 4. It was a one-dimensional scale. And we realized after we wrote those that really wasn't doing the job because a one-dimensional scale conflates authentication and identity proofing. So I want to know that you're the same person who owns the account, the same person I saw last time, but there are some use cases, some edge use cases, where we don't actually want to know who you are. So cases of political dissidents who might be jailed for their political views but still want to share them online, or cases of spies or people who just want to speak anonymously. There's a strong feeling in America that people are entitled to anonymous speech, that it's an important part of democracy. And if we have levels of assurance and security standards that say we think that high security means having a proven identity, we think that that is an issue with democracy itself. So we rewrote the digital identity guidelines for federal agencies. Instead of being one-dimensional, they're now three-dimensional. So we can measure identity proofing, how well we know your legal identity, separately from authentication, how well we are sure that you have used two-factor authentication, that you have the account that you're supposed to have access to, how good your password policy is, things like that. And then the third dimension is around federation. So if you are not logging in at the service you're using, if you're logging in somewhere else, we want to make sure that the information that was passed about you across the wire is secured correctly. So that that was the reasoning behind the whole rewrite of Special Publication 800-63.
Thank you for that. Going through those publications, there's a lot of really good information. So I would encourage listeners to have a look. I'm wondering for some of the smaller or mid-market companies who will look at it and scratch their heads and say, oh my gosh, where do I start with this? Do you have a piece of advice for some of the smaller or mid-market companies and how they might get started? For example, in the Federation piece, which I think is 63C, there's section 8.1, which gives you risks and countermeasures. And it looks really interesting and highly valuable for any organization, really, to pick that up and use it right off the bat. Are there other areas that you think they might start with?
One area that's really easy to bite off is having a good password policy. And password policy has changed a lot since the last guidance we gave. So we used to say that you should include an uppercase, lowercase, number, symbol in all of your passwords, require all of your users to do that. And what we actually found is that when you do that, that gives an attacker a hint as to what's in all of the passwords in your system. So if they know that all of your passwords have a number in them somewhere, it's much easier for them to brute force or reverse a hash of a password that's in your system. So what we now recommend is that you actually don't require any specific complexity, that you just measure how complex the password is and say, okay, as long as it has a certain amount of entropy, let it through, but don't require specific types of complexity. So there's guidance like that in there that's really easy for you. That's just a policy change in your password engine.
Perfect. And thanks for that. Wes, what do you think?
I think an additional piece of advice I would add there is moving to enable multi-factor for every single user in your organization. In some cases, that can be the device itself or the use of an additional device, an authenticator application or device or key, depending on the circumstance. But turning on MFA everywhere to avoid those potential compromises of single factor auth.
I want to come back to that point because I've led you all into the middle of the topic, but let's take it back a step. Think about identity from maybe a bit of a historic point of view and think about how things have changed and then where things like multi-factor fit into the equation today. Because when I think about identity, it's a massive topic. There's access to and across the network and host, domain controllers, containers, runtime, applications, client devices out to IoT. All the people that need access into those different devices, et cetera, as well need to be considered. And then, of course, we've got all the different solutions: authentication, authorization, single sign-on, account provisioning, password reset, and on it goes. But maybe the best approach we can take is to examine the daily pain of different individuals. And maybe we could start with the end user and think about some of the struggles that they go through. Right? I think about 15 years ago when I would sign into my computer, I would type in my password, and then I would log into my email, or maybe first I'd log into the company network and then into the company website, and on it goes. I think 15 years later, and now I've got to do that. Plus I've got some other token or I've got some other second factor. So I've got to wait for a text and wait for a text. Oh, there it is. And now I can actually sign into whatever it is that I need. Wes, if we take it back a step and we think over the last 15 years, how far do you think we've come and how much progress have we made?
I think we've made a lot of progress. I think particularly with the FIDO Alliance, where we have an industry standard now where we're going to bring standards-based approach to multi-factor everywhere. I think we've got a real opportunity to enable this in a way that's easy for the user. You talked about waiting for a text. We're sort of past that point now. You look at things like Microsoft Passport, or actually the current name, I suppose, is Windows Hello, where we provision a secure credential to a device that's secured by the TPM module on the device. And that becomes this piece that the user doesn't need to be aware of. They don't need to know that underneath the hood there's hardware-bound tokens or hardware-protected tokens that are being used in addition to the credentials they're supplying in their web browser or in their application to actually access an application. So we can make that second factor very easy to use and almost seamless or background to the user.
Over that time, we've seen so many more applications, so many more devices. Amir, when I look at some of the challenges that developers in particular and some of the pain that they're going through as their whole world changes into a world of DevOps and working through the CI/CD pipeline, committing lots of code all the time, trying to manage keys in different ways than maybe they have in the past, and worrying about identities, not just on-prem, not just in the cloud, but up and down the stack across containers, very ephemeral type of environments, across many different APIs potentially, being able able to federate across microservices, maybe that are spun down and spun back up quickly. Let's add function as a service on top of that, just to add in some more challenges. So Amir, how do you start to think about taking some of the pain away from the developer?
Let's talk about identity in two steps. One is, who is the user, and is the user authorized to interact with the system? The work that Sarah is doing is laudable. It's important for protecting democracy, but also important for protecting workloads, and that's where Wes's work comes in. Where Aporeto is concerned is application identity. And think about an application as a set of services that are interacting over a network. And in the age of the cloud, those services can be spread all over the place. So our proposition is to automatically generate application identity based on the metadata that exists on the operating system, in the orchestration layer, and through any third-party metadata systems that are out there, for example, any kind of image scanner that might be out there. And when we create cryptographic identity for the application components, we can map how that application interacts with each other, independent of the underlying infrastructure. So the developer wouldn't have to worry about network management or creating gateways and creating peering holes so that two particular services can talk with each other. The developer just specifies what application can talk to what, and the underlying system should take care of that authentication and authorization. Therefore, the underlying system should be able to provide secrets, rotate keys, rotate certificates, and do so rapidly enough so the brute force attack by reverse engineering a password wouldn't work through this rapid rotation of secrets independently to the developer. So our view is the developer should just focus on writing code and allow the infrastructure to take care of application identity and do the authentication authorization per the policy that was described.
When I think about applications and the ephemeral nature of containers in particular, but also up the application stack, and trying to federate identities across that environment, how do I approach that? So you're saying the developer is shielded from that, but what's the magic that's happening in the background to make that happen?
In the DevOps pipeline, when you put out, let's say, a new container or a new serverless service, what you're doing invariably is creating tags, and in the orchestration layer, you're also describing what can talk to what. So the identity is generated automatically when a component of the application comes up. Let's say a container pops up. When the container pops up from the orchestration layer, we know what the tags associated with it are. From the OS, we can determine what binaries that run with it, and then we can incorporate any other information, such as a cloud identity document. All that gets cryptographically signed, and the entire operation takes less than 50 milliseconds. And as long as the workload is up, that cryptographically protected identity affiliated with that workload exists in memory. And when that application then tries to connect another service, that connection is appended with the authenticated identity of the source and verified at destination.
What is it that will help me be able to have this continuity of federation in these types of environments, again, where you're going to be spanning multiple different cloud environments, multiple different services? Let's take it from a standards point of view, Sarah. And I think about OpenID, OAuth, and what have you. It doesn't seem like that quite gets me there.
So what we're looking at Ping, my current employer, so Ping Identity is very focused on zero trust networks. So what that means is that we assume that there is compromise going on somewhere in the network. And so federated authentication of not only users, but as Amir said, applications is really, really important to us. And with the increasing abundance of serverless applications, single page applications, we actually had to extend the OAuth standard to include applications that don't have a database, that can't write down secrets. And so we've come up with standards like PKCE, proof key for code exchange, which is a one-way hashing protocol function for single-page applications that can allow them to make OAuth calls without having to protect client credentials or tokens. So there are really exciting things going on in the standards community today, in the last few years, and coming up in the next few years that are helping us to make applications easier to identify and authenticate.
It'd be interesting to see, too, how standards like SAML, which is now in its teenage teenage years starts to either evolve or does that wane over time? We've seen standards come and go before. For example, we had the WS Star stack of standards, WS Trust, WS Federate, etc., and those kind of disappeared. Are there standards now that we see that may sunset and others that you see kind of rising at this point in time that'll take on some of these new challenges, or are the old standards up to the task?
So one of the standards areas that we're going to have to do a lot of work around is access management. So authorization is a really underdeveloped area of standards. We didn't have a whole lot of microservice technology, a whole lot of GDPR fine-grained consent concepts when we developed OAuth and OpenID Connect. There is a standard called XACML, which is Extensible Access Control Markup Language, which is kind of the best thing we have right now in terms of making a structured data language for access control and authorization. But that whole field is going to have a lot of work done in the next few years, especially with new government regulations coming online around consent and authorization.
So we've talked a little bit about the end user. We've talked a little bit about the developer as well, and given some ideas in terms of some of the solutions and some of the approaches that organizations might want to start to take. One of the other areas that we haven't really covered off yet is around the security pro themselves and the IT pro who's looking at provisioning users and trying to define their roles and their policies. What's new in that space, Wes, that organizations could be thinking about and looking at?
So one of the things that we find pretty consistently across organizations is as we move to this identity-driven model, if you will, for delivering services to the end user. The end user gets a better experience, but the IT side of it often struggles with transitioning, whether it's due to skill sets or training or just general understanding of these new concepts where, traditionally they were very sort of perimeter focused and they learned to work with your traditional perimeter, and shifting their mindset is often very difficult as they try to educate, I suppose, on the newer technologies. And with the convergence to identity-driven security, there's also role shifts and role convergence in some cases where you have one individual who might be administering access for multiple services, and it's no longer just the AD guy, right? He's now, you now have this identity guy who's provisioning access to various types of applications. He's getting a little bit more in touch with these different services they're provisioning for their end users. And so that's one of the things that we set out to do actually with our bot, is try to help alleviate some of that friction for the IT side of things as they move to deliver modern services to their end users.
And so your bot has some AI capabilities, and I know that Sarah and Amir are going to want to weigh in on this as well. Wes, when you look at the challenges with, again, all the applications that we have, the devices, all the different users, all the requirements that they have, do we need to have AI in the background or maybe in the foreground now helping us out to be able to solve these problems that we used to do first in a manual way, then we started to do it a little bit in more of an automated way, and now maybe it's something that we need cognitive services to help us out with?
From my standpoint, I believe AI should serve humanity. It should augment the intelligence that we already have. We've really delivered through that principle in what we've built here. We believe that the analyst sitting in the chair is the one who's got the best understanding of the situation. So we're not trying to replace those analysts. What we want to do is make their lives a little bit easier, reduce some of the complexities that they have to deal with, providing natural language interfaces, and we'll take care of some logic behind the scenes to go and perform the appropriate tasks for them. But they're the person who knows the user or knows the situation that customer calling in is dealing with better than we could ever automate. And we want to make that analyst's life easier and leverage their understanding to, make our technology better.
Amir, what do you think?
Well, security threats are constantly changing. And in order for anyone to have an effective security regime on their applications, that security regime needs to be adaptive, which means that you do learn from behavior, and therefore you can adjust to behavior deviations, whether that's done through negligence or through an attack. Likewise, when the application behavior changes for, let's say, redeployment, that's typically captured in the orchestration layer, where the developer says, now I'm going from version, let's say, 1.0 to version 2.0, and this is the new connectivity pattern. That work is automatically done by the developer, and by learning from that pattern, we can then transcribe that behavior into a set of policies to govern application behavior and flag any deviations from it. So yes, AI or machine learning or whatever you want to call it, let's call it an algorithmic approach to security, absolutely does play a role going forward. And it's there to service the security professionals to know that A, things are in accordance to plan, and B, when there's a deviation, they get alerted on the right facts.
So Sarah, if I put a bit of a label on it and I call it invisible identity, are we going to get there where as a user, I have this simplified access, I no longer maybe need to remember a password, I am analyzed based on my behavior and other attributes?
We are. So at Ping, we call this concept zero login. And what zero login means to us is that we're smart about using AI and machine learning to help us be contextual. So we want to know what context the user is making calls in. So are they trying to do something that an attacker would never do? If I'm ordering a book from Amazon to my home on my credit card, is that something an attacker would normally do? Never, right? That doesn't benefit them at all. And so why would you put a password prompt in front of that user? Why not just let them in? So we're looking at using AI to score the context of the application. How risky is this application call? And then we also want to use it to be adaptive about the user themselves. So did this user recently change their password? Are they on a new device? Are they logging in at a strange time of day, right? So how is their device moving? Is the accelerometer picking up normal patterns that it would normally pick up? How are they swiping? How are they typing? Things like that. We want to use all of that data to give us a risk score so that if the risk score is very low, maybe we can take some of the friction out of the authentication ceremony. Or if the risk score is high, maybe we can add a lot of friction. Maybe we want a higher level of second factor authentication in order to make sure that that person really is who they say they are.
Now, over time, security tools tend to coalesce into larger suites, and we layer on top different functionality and they get bundled together by single vendors. Over time, any market will start to consolidate, and it moves away from a best of breed approach to one that, again, hopefully is easier for the user to be able to work within. And by user in this case, I mean the security pro or the developer. Wes, I'll lead off with you on this one. Where are we at in terms of moving away from this best of breed or worst of all tools cobbled together to more of a suites-based approach, or are we pretty much still in a fragmented type of market today?
I think we're moving to a sort of holistic approach to security. We're a Microsoft partner, so obviously Microsoft is the one that sort of jumps to my mind. There are other vendors out there, for example, VMware acquiring their identity solution a number of years ago and starting to converge that with their mobile device management, right? Starting to pull all these different pieces in, because I think the industry as a whole is recognizing we need to have a holistic approach to security and not just buy individual pieces off the shelf and hope that the analysts can string it together on the back end. I very much believe in what Microsoft has done with the Microsoft 365 suite, particularly EMS and Windows, the integration there, where you've got your Windows devices joined into your cloud directory and you've got machine learning on the back end looking at the signals from the various authentications and threat activity on the endpoints. And all those pieces sort of feed each other with intelligence, right? And make each one better.
I'm not sure if it's a fair question to ask a startup, but Amir, from an Aporeto standpoint, what do you think in terms of solutions coalescing together? Or is this something we deal with at the standards layer?
I think we primarily deal with it at the standards layer. Now, there is a Microsoft identity, there is a Google identity, there is a VMware identity. I have to point out that economically, and from a game theory perspective, each of these big vendors have the desire and the goal to create a lock-in effect. So they don't necessarily have the incentive to have that identity, let's say Google identity, work in the Amazon cloud. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense for these players given the size that they have. Now, let's talk about a startup like Aporeto. What we do is create application identity regardless of where it resides and regardless of where it runs. So we do leverage native cloud identity, whether it's AWS or GCP or Azure, but we create a uniform identity that goes across the multiple layers. This is because, well, A, we're trying to solve a real user solution. B is because the game's ultimately different for a startup. We have to create value, and creating a lock-in effect doesn't make a whole lot of sense for us. So yes, we do need to go towards this unified identity regime. Standards do help a whole lot, but startups like Aporeto play a key role in trying to level the playing field.
So Sarah, from your standpoint, how are you feeling about organizations' ability to work across different cloud environments? Easy for me to say, across, say, GCP and AWS and Azure, and being able to easily federate or be able to manage identities across those different environments?
So a lot of people are having to go to outside companies to manage identity and not to Amazon or Google or Microsoft itself. So one of Ping's goals is to be kind of a Switzerland of all of the identity providers and say, look, if you want to be multi-cloud, we will manage your identity across wherever you want to use, whatever new technology comes out in the next 10 years. You won't have to rip out your whole identity system. You can keep the identity system the same and use whatever kind of cloud you want to. And that's not just happening in identity, also in terms of security. I'm on the board of the OpenID Foundation, and one of our working groups is called Risk and Incident Sharing and Coordination. Google is part of that, Amazon is part of that, and the idea behind that is that we want to know, so the financial industry has been for years had something like a credit score, right? And we want to have something like an identity score so that if a Gmail account gets compromised, we know that account recovery usually happens through email, and that several account compromises could cascade from that. So if Google is aware of an account compromise, how do they transmit that to an Amazon that should know that if this account is recovered, you should be aware that that happened fraudulently? So we're working between clouds, between organizations to do real-time identity scoring. So that's really exciting as well.
Very interesting work. And so, Sarah, earlier on, you talked about GDPR, and it was very prescient. Some of the writing and the work that you and your co-authors did with the Special Pub 800-63, the Digital Identity Guidelines, around GDPR, that if I'm implementing that really well, it's not going to deal with all 9 rights, but it's going to put me in a much better position to be able to take those on. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. So a lot of people are scared of GDPR. They see it as something that they have to comply with. And I like to tell people it's really a way, it's a leverage for you to get money from your management teams and your executives to do the things that you've been wanting to do for years, right? When I talk to identity teams at small to large businesses, they've been wanting to up security, up privacy, to break things down into microservices and to make sure that people actually want to use the services that they're giving them, right? So these are things that identity teams have been pushing for, but haven't gotten funding for. And GDPR gives them the leverage to say, hey, look, there's teeth now, there's enforcement now, we will lose money, we will get fined if we don't do the things that we've been pushing for. So it's really a great opportunity for the security community and the identity community to push for funding from our executive teams and our boards to help us do right by our customers.
So we've come a long way in a very short period of time. We've looked at the threat radar to see what organizations should be looking at. And in fact, we expanded that out to look at identity in the context of human safety. We've looked at identity within a historic context today and looking forward. Now we're at the point where we look at the actions your organization should take this week. Mine is to go out and Google the video that Sarah's got on identity in 100 words. You got to spell it out though, TEN, etc., 100 words. And you did it at the RSA conference, which is just a fun video to watch. Fun, but at the same time, highly educational. It's kind of like TED Talk meets identity. Sarah, what's your action for organizations to take away this week?
Organizations should join ID Pro. So ID Pro is the first professional organization for identity practitioners. So like security has ISACA, privacy has IAPP. We had nothing for identity professionals to join, to network, to talk about emerging vulnerabilities until last year. So ID Pro launched last year. You can go to idpro.org/join. You can join as an individual, or you can join as an entire company. It's a great place. It's a great organization, and I highly recommend it.
We'll put that up in the show notes. I'm going there right now. Amir, what action should organizations take away this week?
I would recommend organizations to further familiarize themselves with what application identity is and how it's separate from user identity and complements user identity. So in that regard, there are a lot of good blogs in the various Kubernetes communities where you can learn about this, or you can go to aporeto.com/blog and look at our write-ups about what application identity is and how that can create better security for applications, whether they're in a local setting, in a local cloud, hybrid cloud, or multi-cloud environment.
Wes, taking us home, what actions do you have for organizations?
Start with turning MFA on for all your admin accounts, and then figure out a path forward for turning multi-factor on for the rest of your user base. I think that is one of the most important things that organizations can do these days to protect their user identities.
And Sarah, do you have a conference you're going to be speaking at that you want to plug?
Yes, Identiverse, which is the world's largest industry identity conference, is coming up this month, June 24th through 27th in Boston. I would love to see you there.
And how can people reach you?
I'm on Twitter at Sarah K. Squire.
Wes, same question.
Not speaking about anything in the near future. I am reachable on Twitter at EMS_Wes. Ping me there for any sort of identity-related questions or just for general info going on in the industry.
And Amir, what do you have coming up and how can people reach you?
Well, I'm currently at the Gartner Security Conference in Washington, D.C. There are a lot of good publications that have been put out by the conference itself. I would encourage listeners to look up Neil McDonald and see how he's recommending workload protection, whether it's running in a local or a hybrid cloud. And additionally, feel free to go to Aporeto.com/blog. We try to keep that fresh and update users with a lot of content, or interact with me directly on Twitter at Amir_Sharif, SHARIF.
Well, thanks very much. And I appreciate the time today. Well, there you have it. Threat Actions This Week, recorded June the 5th, 2018. I'm David Senf. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again next week.
Wes, you're definitely Canadian because you're so nice.
It wasn't my thick accent didn't give it away.